Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of English 232 American Literature. This week we have a good bit on the agenda. We're going to be talking a little bit about your reading responses from last week. Then we're going to be talking about this week's authors, Samuel Clemens and Charles Chesnutt. And then, believe it or not, we're going to be talking about the midterm. Your midterms, of course, aren't due this week. They are due 2 weeks from Friday. But I am bringing them up now basically so that you know what's coming and you can start getting ready. And we'll be closing out by talking about what's due. So, first off, reading responses. As I'm recording this, you guys are still working on your reading responses. I think I've had about half of them submitted so far, and I'm sure I'll get the rest tonight, as they are, of course, due tonight on Sunday. But I've already started looking at them, and I can say that I have my reading response of the week. Yay! And this is for Mr. Andrew Alemond, or Alemond. My apologies if I am pronouncing it incorrectly. So why is Mr. Andrew the reading response of the week? Well, he did a really nice job with his response. So first, in a basic way, if we just look, he has followed instructions, right? We've got the quote, we've got his response on this side, all the way through, and his response to the guiding question. Beautiful. But then when I look more closely, I see that he's clearly thinking deeply about the reading. So he has his guiding question, and when I look at his responses, I see that he's totally thinking about both the text and the question. So for example here, he's got the quote, where the narrator is talking about for what diseases like alcohol. And then over here, he says he calls the slide downward a disease, which tends to make me think it's not his fault, but a medical disorder. Is this a justification or an accurate explanation? So he's thinking about the text. He's saying, like, okay, he's using this word disease. What does that really mean? Do I believe him? And he does this all the way through. So he does a nice job of asking questions, of summarizing what he's thinking at any given moment. And this is just a personal thing that I really love. When we get to the end and the shocking turn of events happens, he reacts. The cat is found in the wall. Lol. So the beast gives him away to the cops in his cellar. So overall, these notes are beautiful. He's totally meeting the minimum of one per 2 pages, like by a ton. But I also see in his responses that he's really thinking deeply about the reading. Sweet. Now, when we come down here at his actual reading response, we continue to see that he's thinking deeply about the reading, and he's doing really the most important thing that you have to do in a reading response, which are two things. One, answering the question, and two, using good evidence from the text to back up your answer. So let's take a look at what he writes. I think the narrator is acting on both free will and of a general case of being a drunk. Primarily, as he grew into a man, he grew day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless for the feelings of others, which demonstrates that this may be part of his inherent nature and personality. On the other hand, he states, my disease grew upon me for what diseases like alcohol, which tells me that his disease of alcoholism has taken hold, makes it hard, if not impossible, for him to maintain a level head and make good choices not to kill. Despite the story leading me to think that he is ill from alcoholism, there is more evidence to the contrary, specifically in the final pages where he hides his wife's body in the wall and he premeditates the killing of the cat who so-called caused him to kill his wife. Therefore, his guilt is evident to me. He's guilty as sin, and no matter which way you look at it, he is accountable for his actions, regardless of whether he is drunk or sober. Right, so first he talks a little bit about this question of whether the narrator is really in control of himself. Does he really have free will? And then he talks about what that means in terms of how he sees the narrator's guilt. And in this case, he concludes that the narrator is guilty. So Andrew, great job. Wonderful use of quotes and evidence in your response to the guiding question. Reading response of the week. A few other things about reading responses to keep in mind. When you get your feedback on your reading response, which hopefully I'll be able to have to you by Wednesday, Thursday at the latest, you will actually be getting both a grade as well as this rubric. Basically, if you go back to where you originally submitted the response and you just scroll down, you'll see this rubric and different boxes will be highlighted, and that's where your grade will come from. So If you have, if your reading journal notes are kind of a mess, then you'll see one point highlighted. If your response to the guiding question is awesome, you'll see the excellent box highlighted, like that. And that way, when you see, like, okay, I got a 75 on my reading response, you can look at the rubric and it'll help explain where that grade came from and what you need to do in the future to do better. Um, Other thing, so last week you guys only took notes on and responded to one story. This week we are upping the ante. You're going to be reading 4 different stories. Each of them are, fairly short. Um, but 4 stories total. And so how do you take notes on 4 stories? So you should still only be submitting one document. All you have to do is on the table where you're taking your notes, just when you start taking notes on a new story, you just put the name of the story, Roughing It, the name of the author, Clemens, and then you take your notes. You write the name of the next story, A True Story, Clemens, you take your notes. Whether this Youth, Chestnut, you take your notes. That way, when it's time for you to go back and use your notes to plan your midterm, you're not taking a look at like 20 different documents. You just have the 3 or 4 reading responses we've done by then. Okay, that is it for reading responses. So, who are we reading this week? This week, we're reading folks who I would call voices of the people. So, where are we in time? We are in post-Civil War America at this point. And post-Civil War America is a crazy place. Remember, there was a civil war, right? One part of the government is fighting another part of the government. And there were points in the war where it wasn't clear the North was going to win. It was very contentious. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. It was terrible. And so now the question is, how is the country going to be made whole again? And clearly the country is very different. There's now this huge population of people who used to be slaves who are now free. What the heck are they going to do? And at this moment, there's starting to be this influx of a variety of immigrants from all over the world. While before the Civil War, almost all immigrants were from Western Europe, Northern Europe. So we're thinking Britain, we're thinking Germany, France. Um, After the Civil War, all of a sudden that opens up. We got people coming from Italy, people coming from China, people coming from Ireland. And so there's that question too of like, how are we going to be a country? So that's one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening is that in literature, there's this move towards literature. And so we have this nice quote from the anthology that helps sort of explain what's happening here. It's this emphasis on situations and characters from ordinary, everyday life. If you've ever read sort of older literature, it's often, dukes and duchesses and fancy people and blah, blah, blah. No. At this point, we are thinking about the everyday Joe Schmoes. And so in this literature, instead of even like a fancy author explaining what's happening, they're letting the people themselves tell their own stories in their own language. And so the question for us to be thinking about is the authors we're reading this week, how do they give voice to people who are typically marginalized or ignored? And how do they encourage the reader to connect with a rougher, poorer, or less privileged person? Which is kind of what the country needs at this moment, right? Everything's been blown apart. We've got all sorts of different people. And so how great is it that literature can help people connect to people who they may not have ever seen or met otherwise? And so that's what we're going to be thinking about in this literature this week. So the people who are going to be doing this are engaging in something called regionalism. And so basically this is literature that depicts the diversity of our different regions, including language and culture. So it's this idea of outsider voices instead of this big national unified voice. If you think about reality TV shows, this is a weird comparison, but this is kind of replicated this. So shows like Duck Dynasty, Jersey Shore, The Real Housewives, Ice Rebels, all of these shows are hyper-focused on a very specific community in the United States. And so people from, well, I don't know, Michigan might watch and love Duck Dynasty, and in some weird way it helps them connect with Louisiana. People in Tangipahoa Parish might watch Real Housewives of the OC, and all of a sudden they think about and understand California in a different way. And we can contrast this with like sitcoms that traditionally tended to kind of emphasize middle class suburbia or urban professionals, this sense of like mainstream or normal America, as opposed to reality shows that are all about what these unique little pieces. And that's what we're going to see in our stories this week are more examples of a focus on these very unique parts of America. Our guides and all this are our two authors. We've got Samuel Clemens, who you may know better as Mark Twain. He is a real fun dude all the time. This first quote here, I think, is a great way to think about him. He was less interested in teaching young readers how to conform to social norms than in presenting realistic images. Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, keeps it real. He's not about being cute. He's not about painting a rosy picture. He's about creating something very real. Um, but at the same time, he would create something real so he could be funny about it. He would write satire. He had these humorous pieces, generally that would poke fun at people who thought that they were better than other people. The highfalutin, the hypocritical. Those are the people that Samuel Clemens had in his crosshairs. We also have this week Charles Chesnutt, who, like Twain, also grew up in the South and has this really strong sense of the world down here, the culture, the language. However, he's a particularly interesting guy. If you take a look at this picture, you may not be able to guess it, but he was a black man. But as you can see, he was very light-skinned, kind of had straight hair. And so he was, as this very light-skinned black person, kind of in this weird in-between space between the black community and white communities. And when you look at his story this week, we see him explicitly thinking about that weird in-between space. So again, I mentioned this idea of this hyper focus on very particular communities, and that's what we're going to see with Charles Chesnutt, is very specifically thinking about the experiences of freed black people, particularly the very light-skinned. Now, in both of these stories, one of the ways that they help us connect, one of the ways that they help us understand these communities is by using dialect. And all dialect means is a regional way of speaking a language. In the U.S., there are more than a dozen dialects. If you click this link in the lecture notes, you can actually play with a little map that shows you that will let you actually listen to different dialects from all over the U.S. For example, if you think about Southeast Louisiana, you might think about how differently people from the Bayou speak versus people in Baton Rouge versus people in New Orleans. Heck, I live in New Orleans, and there are some parts of town where people speak differently than other parts of town, right? All of that is dialect. In literature, the way that you represent that is by writing the words exactly as they're spoken instead of how they might be spelled in a dictionary, which can make it kind of hard to read. The way to make it easier to read is actually just to read it out loud, and then you can actually kind of hear it. For example, well, sah, I was raised in Old Fo Jenny by my mother. She was raised in Maryland, and my soul, she was terrible when she'd get started. So when you see this, Turrible, you might be like, what the heck is a turrible? But then when you say, oh, turrible, terrible, of course, it becomes pretty easy to know what they're saying. Or here, well, sah, you're like, oh, sah, sir, okay, I got that. Here, give it a try yourself. Try reading this one out loud. Okay, so for example here, I'd be like, what is a Kinder? But then when you say kind or sad, you're like, oh, kinda sad, okay, right? Not that hard. So the interesting thing about dialect is that it tells us things about the character and their relationships with each other. So this is an excerpt from the second story you guys are going to be reading. Is that right? Oh, I'm sorry. From the fourth story you guys are going to be reading. And what I'd like you to do is just take a look at this excerpt and ask yourself, what assumptions would you make about the first speaker, about the second speaker, about who holds more power in society and who holds more power in this interaction? Let's take a moment, read it over. So it's probably apparent right away that one of these folks has a dialect that is associated with poverty, a dialect that's associated with not being well educated, while the other one has a dialect that's associated with being well educated and perhaps with wealth, right? So, yes, sir, if I ain't disturbing you too much. Not at all. Have a seat over here behind the vine where it is cool. What can I do for you? Excuse me, sir, she continued when she had sat down on the edge of a chair. Excuse me, sir, I was looking for my husband. I heard you was a big man and I had lived here a long time and I allowed you wouldn't mind if I come round and ask you if you ever heard of a mulatto man by the name of Sam Taylor choiring round these here churches amongst the people for his wife Liza Jane. Mr. Ryder seemed to think for a moment. There used to be many such cases right after the war, he said, but it has been so long that I've forgotten them. There are very few now, but tell me your story and it may refresh my memory. So when we look at this, right, like we make certain assumptions about this woman and we make certain assumptions about this man. And this is without knowing anything else about the story, just from the way that they speak. The other interesting thing when we look at this is that this is a beautiful example of juxtaposition, where the way that she speaks and the way that he speaks, like he sounds even more educated and refined because he is speaking next to her. She sounds even less educated. She sounds even more country because her speech is next to his. And that's juxtaposition. And so when you're reading these stories and you're looking at these interactions, thinking about as an audience member, what's the author trying to do? Whose side does he want you to be on? And how can you tell? And how is he using dialect to help you be on someone's side? So when you're reading the stories, try to picture the people who are speaking. For example, when you're reading the Jim Smiley story, the storyteller in that story reminds me of my uncles, right? Like I really connect to it. My family's from the country around Vicksburg, Mississippi, and he reminds me of just like my fast talking, crazy storytelling uncles. Um, and so try to do that. Try to picture who these people are like to help you connect with the story. Okay, so as you're reading this week, things to look out for. 1. Dialect can be hard to read. Give yourself some extra time to get used to it. Do not try to read these things super quickly. You might get tripped up. 2. The first 2 stories you're reading by Samuel Clemens are meant to be humorous. If you take them too seriously, you are making a mistake. They are meant to be funny. And 3. The stories this week are kind of hard to find. They're going to be in the middle of Volume 2 from the rental textbooks, or for those of y'all who rented online, they're at the beginning of Volume C. But if you have the textbooks from the on-campus textbook rental, just know that in Volume 2, the page numbers actually start over in the middle of the book, and that's where you're going to find these stories. All right, this week for your reading response, you're reading the 4 assigned stories, taking your reading notes as usual, and this is what you're responding to. Choose one of the 4 stories and explain how the author gives voice to someone who would typically be marginalized or ignored. How do they encourage the reader to connect with the rougher, poorer, or less privileged person? Okay. So now is the perfect time to take a quick break. I'm going to now talk a bit about how to get ready for your midterm paper. So the midterm paper prompt, easy peasy. You're picking one of the big questions from the course that we talked about last week, and you're going to explain your own thoughts on the question and then use at least 3 of the texts to discuss different perspectives on that question. You're going to be illustrating your points using quotes and examples from the text. This will be 4 to 6 pages, double spaced, Times New Roman, size 12 font. You're going to be turning in an outline in about 2 weeks on June 20th, and the paper is due midnight, June 25th. So what you should start with is just doing a little bit of brainstorming. So first, thinking about which of the questions you feel like most relates to the readings we've done so far. So as you're reading this week and next, you should be thinking, okay, which of these questions do I want to focus on? How does a person know they are free? What decides an individual's success or failure? Or do community and family do more to restrict our freedom or to enhance it? And just try in your mind to imagine how the protagonist from each story might answer that question. That's one way to help you figure out kind of what the story is trying to say. So, for example, how does a person know they are free? I like when I think about that question and the story, The Black Cat. I would say that the answer from the Black Cat would probably be people don't know whether they're free, right? Like we've got this guy, he's struggling with alcoholism, he seems a little crazy, he's doing things that he wishes he wasn't doing, and then at some point he kind of likes doing them. And I feel like this is a guy who, you know, if I say I'm like our reading response person of the week, like I might say like, yeah, he's definitely free and making his own decisions and he's guilty. Um, but he doesn't even know that he is, right? So that's how I might answer the question from that story's point of view. So yeah, so you're just going to be taking some time and just sort of thinking about how each of these questions relate to the stories. You also want to think about how you would answer the question, and then which stories agree with you, which ones disagree with you. So here's an example of how you might brainstorm. And in this case, I am doing it with some young adult novels instead of the stories. That way you can still write about all the stories. So which question most relates to the readings you've done so far? How does a person know they are free? And then I try to think about how the different protagonists might try to answer that question. For example, in the Hunger Games, it's hard to know. People think they're free when they aren't. More than being left alone is really about being able to take care of people you love, right? Because in the Hunger Games, it's all about Katniss trying to take care of her sister and her family, and eventually Peeta and Gale, and then like everyone in the world. Versus like in The Giver, being free is really about making your own choices, right? Like once Jonas starts working with the Giver, he doesn't think as much about his family, or at least not in the same way. It's really about him thinking about freedom in a bigger sense. And then when I think about myself, I would say that Hunger Games is really closer to how I think, because I really believe that people are social and that freedom is social and that it's about being able to maintain relationships. And I think that The Giver is kind of weirdly antisocial. And so then, once you kind of have thought through some ideas on what you might want to write, then it's time to outline. And in your outline, you need to first just establish your perspective on the question. You want to make sure you have at least 3 stories, including one story that agrees with you and one story that disagrees with you. Then you have to close by extending the discussion. So again, outlining it, my perspective is people often think they know they are free based on being able to do whatever they want. But I think it's more about having the ability to be with and support the people you want to be with. For example, having a good job, to the feeling of freedom, fighting for marriage equality. So I think those are examples from life that support my perspective. Then a story that agrees with me, The Hunger Games. The narrator's whole focus is on saving herself. So there's the fact that she's done all of this hunting before she's picked for the game so that she could feed her family. And then how when she figures out that she can take care of Peeta, how all of a sudden she connects with him too. And in The Giver, the lack of freedom in this world is more than people, society won't let them make mistakes, not that they can't take care of each other. So contrasting between the freedom in his memories and the life in the closed society, um, and how the society sees choice. So then I would close by extending the discussion. What we think freedom is. So there you go. Here's an example of how I might outline it. Of course, in your own example, you will be using the stories from this semester. You'll be using 3 stories. When you outline it, you're going to be using a template that you will be able to find on Moodle. So let's go back to Moodle. So, come on, computer, get it together. All right. So, on Moodle, if you just click here, midterm paper outline template, you will. My apologies. I'm a little trouble finding what I'm looking for. So, if you click on that, you will download a template that you. Sorry, guys, having trouble. You'll download a template that looks like this, and basically just fill in and respond to these questions to help you outline your paper. All right. When you're doing this, remember you don't need to write in complete sentences. You're just jotting down ideas and evidence, right? So this isn't all in complete, clear sentences. That's not the point. And if you write your outline, you submit it to me, and I give you feedback, and then you realize that you hate your outline, that's fine. You can change your paper. You don't have to ask me. This is just a way to help you get ready. Other important thing is turn in your outline on time. That way I'll be able to give you feedback so that you can then use the feedback before the final midterm paper is due. Last piece of advice is that when you're writing your outline, do not cop out. For example, how does a person know they are free? If you answer, every person's sense of freedom is different. Some people feel free because they have money. Other people feel free because they have religion. There is no way to know if you are free. That is copping out. That is not a real answer. Of course, everyone's sense of freedom is different. You've got to say something more substantial, more specific, okay? Say something that you can defend. You've got to step it up. So you might talk about your own experience. You might say, like, well, okay, everyone's definition of freedom is different, but here's what they have in common. They're all about X. Or you might say, a person can't know they're free. Like, they might think they're free because blah, blah, however, blah, blah, blah. Some sort of a much more specific answer then is different for everyone. Please, please, please do not write. It's different for everyone. Okay. So here's what's due this week. Your reading response for Clemens and Chestnut. Take notes on all 4 of the stories. Choose one of the stories. Explain how the author gives voice to someone who typically be marginalized, and so on and so forth. And finally, start working on your midterm planning. The outlines are due June 20th. All right, that is all for this week. Bye now.